My name is Sarah, and for 15 years I've worked in the high-pressure world of forensic psychiatry in Seattle. My job involves evaluating individuals who have committed serious crimes while suffering from severe mental breaks. You'd think this would make me the most cautious person on earth, but sometimes empathy clouds your judgment. In the summer of 2024, I learned the hard way that the professional boundaries I maintained at work were there for a very good reason. It all started with a woman I'll call Elena. We had been colleagues at a residential treatment center for years. Elena was soft-spoken, almost timid, and we formed a tight-knit group with 2 other nurses. Even when Elena was on extended medical leave for her own struggles with chronic schizophrenia, she'd always show up for our girls' nights. She was open about her diagnosis, and since I worked with the same conditions daily, I felt no prejudice toward her. One evening over dinner, Elena looked distraught. She told us she'd been evicted from her apartment complex in downtown Seattle. Her story was simple. She claimed she had accidentally walked into a neighbor's unit in the middle of the night because all the doors in her hallway looked identical. According to her, the neighbors overreacted, called the police, and got her blacklisted. I felt a wave of pity for her, thinking she was being unfairly judged for a simple, honest mistake. Elena eventually looked me in the eyes and asked the question I should have seen coming. She was homeless and had nowhere to go. My apartment was tiny, just 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living room barely large enough for a TV. I lived there with my 2 highly social cats. Despite the lack of space, my habit of saying yes to people in need kicked in. I told her she could stay with me, thinking it would only be for a short while. We set up a makeshift living space for her in my small lounge. I offered to get rid of my sofa to fit a proper bed, but she insisted the couch was fine. Because the living room was connected to the hallway by an open arch, I hung a heavy velvet curtain to give her at least a shred of privacy. I kept the door from my bedroom to the kitchen open so my cats could roam freely at night, unaware of how much this layout would soon haunt me. At the time, Elena wasn't working while I was pulling grueling 12-hour shifts at the hospital. I suffer from chronic insomnia and rely on prescription sleep aids, so I value silence. I asked her to be quiet on nights before my early shifts, and I even bought her a high-end espresso machine to make her stay more comfortable. I placed it in the kitchen right outside my bedroom door, hoping a little luxury would help her feel more at home. The very first night was a disaster. I had to be up at 5 in the morning, but Elena was up every hour to smoke on the balcony, waking me up each time the door clicked. By 4 a.m., the loud grinding of the coffee machine jolted me awake for good. When I politely asked if she could wait until I was actually up, explaining that my lack of sleep could trigger my health issues, she just stared at me blankly before promising to try harder next time. Her promises meant nothing. Every night, the pattern repeated. The smell of cigarettes and the roar of the espresso machine at 3 or 4 in the morning. She also developed strange eating habits, clearing out my entire pantry in minutes. I'd come home to find a whole loaf of sourdough gone or a gallon of milk finished. I told her to feel at home, but the cost and a constant lack of sleep were starting to wear me down to a dangerous breaking point. Elena's hygiene was the next issue. Her long black hair was everywhere, clogging the shower drain, sticking to the kitchen tiles, and even appearing in my bed. She left clippings on the floor and was generally neglectful of the shared space. I tried to be subtle, leaving cleaning supplies in the bathroom, but she ignored them. Eventually, I had to ask her directly to clean up, using "we" to soften the blow, but her behavior didn't change at all. My cats, who were usually the most affectionate creatures, began to change. They stopped going near the living room and spent all their time hiding under my bed. One morning, I found their water bowl completely dry and wiped clean with a towel, even though I had filled it the night before. Elena claimed they must have tipped it over, but there was no water on the floor. I felt a cold knot of suspicion forming. Something was very wrong in my home. Tension reached a breaking point when my grandmother's vintage saucepan was ruined. It was a sentimental piece from the 60s, and Elena had left it on the stove until it was scorched black, never even offering an apology. Soon after, I discovered my prescription sleeping pills were missing from my nightstand. I had exactly 20 left when I went to work, and the bottle was empty when I returned. Elena denied taking them, but I was the only other person with a key. The sweltering summer heat made the tiny apartment feel like a pressure cooker. I felt like a prisoner in my own bedroom, trapped with my 2 cats while a stranger took over my life. Then, out of the blue, an old classmate from elementary school messaged me on Facebook. He had seen my post about having a new roommate and asked if I knew the real reason Elena had been evicted from her previous home. I told him her story about the wrong door, but his reply made my stomach drop. He revealed that Elena hadn't just walked into the wrong apartment. She had broken in and was found standing over a sleeping baby with a kitchen knife in her hand. The father had woken up just in time to wrestle her to the ground. My blood ran cold as I realized I had invited a person capable of such a nightmare into my home. Paranoid and shaking, I knew I had to get her out, but I wanted to avoid a violent confrontation. Our agreement required a 30-day notice, and I dreaded what she might do during those 4 weeks. I sat her down and gently explained that the apartment was too small and I needed my space back. She looked crushed and insisted on staying for the full 30 days, a request I was legally forced to accept. The very first night after our talk, she was back to her old ways, grinding coffee at 2:30 in the morning. When I begged her to stop, she didn't even acknowledge my presence. She just sat on the sofa, staring blankly out the window. I started to see the darkness in her eyes that my friends hadn't noticed. Out of desperation, I eventually hid the coffee maker and the saucepans in the attic where she couldn't reach them. A few nights later, I woke up to my boyfriend poking me in the arm. He was staying over because I was too terrified to be alone with her. He whispered for me to look at the doorway. There stood Elena, perfectly silent, her long black hair draped over her face as she stared at us in the dark. It felt like a scene straight out of a horror movie, reminiscent of the ending of a paranormal thriller. I screamed at her to leave the room, and she slammed the door so hard I heard something metal hit the floor. When I checked it the next morning, I found a large kitchen knife lying exactly where she had been standing. Hysterical and sobbing, I gathered every sharp object in the house and locked them in the attic. I realized then that she had likely been watching me sleep for weeks, waiting for a moment of weakness. The final straw came at 3 in the morning when I woke to a strange smell. I walked into the kitchen to find Elena burning dry coffee grounds in a frying pan, her eyes black and completely void of emotion. She was clearly in the middle of a full psychotic break. I managed to put out the small fire before she retreated into the living room in total silence, leaving me trembling in the smoke. While she was at a doctor's appointment the next day, I packed her bags and texted her that she was no longer welcome. I offered to pay for a hostel just to keep her away. She eventually took her things and left the keys without a word. Months later, I heard that she had set her own new apartment on fire, claiming the voices told her she had to burn everything to save her friends. Elena was eventually sentenced for aggravated arson and sent to a high-security mental institution, ironically, the very facility where we both used to work. It turns out she had stopped taking her medication weeks before moving in with me. I still lie awake at night, thinking about my cats and that kitchen knife on the floor, wondering how close I really came to never waking up at all. This incident takes me back to 2018, a period I usually try to keep buried in the deepest corners of my subconscious. At 19, I was spiraling out of control, fueled by a toxic mix of college freedom and a complete disregard for my bipolar medication. After a particularly dark episode, I found myself committed to the adult psychiatric ward of a state hospital in Detroit. It was a world away from the adolescent units I had visited before. This was a place for the truly broken. The facility was a decaying monument to failed social systems, managed by staff who seemed more like prison guards than healers. Without any formal introduction or moment to collect myself, a nurse led me to a cramped, sterile room. She gestured toward the other bed and told me, "This is your roommate," before disappearing back into the fluorescent-lit hallway. My new companion was a woman in her late 50s named Lucia, who sat perfectly still, staring at the floor. Lucia was a small, intense woman with a tattoo on her forearm that caught my eye immediately, a cartoonish red devil, but with a chubby face of a baby. She didn't acknowledge my greeting or even blink as I settled into my side of the room. The air in the ward was thick with the smell of floor wax and unwashed bodies, and the distant, muffled screams of other patients provided a constant, jarring soundtrack to my first few hours of confinement. As night fell, the energy in the ward shifted from a dull ache to a sharp electric tension. While we were lining up for our evening medication, the men in the high-security wing across the hall began a coordinated assault on the glass of their unit. One man was rhythmically slamming his bald head against a reinforced window, smiling all the while others shrieked and leaped around him. It was a level of raw adult unpredictability that terrified me to my core. I managed to get back to my room, but sleep felt like a dangerous luxury. I lay in the dark, listening to Lucia's shallow breathing, my anxiety peaking with every distant thud from the hallway. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I slipped into that fuzzy, half-conscious state between dreaming and waking. That was when I felt a strange, localized pressure on my forehead and the sensation of something hot and wet dripping onto my cheeks. My eyes snapped open, and my heart nearly stopped. Lucia was standing over my bed, leaning so close that I could smell her stale breath. She had one hand pressed firmly against my forehead, while her other hand was balled into a tight fist against her own chest. Her eyes were completely blank, devoid of any human emotion, looking right through me as if I were a piece of furniture. She began to speak, but the words were a chaotic, nonsensical stream of tongues. I was paralyzed, caught in the grip of a primal terror that made it impossible to scream. She started to wipe the sweat from my brow with a frantic, erratic motion, her voice getting louder and faster with every second. The nonsense she was chanting felt like a dark incantation, and the pressure on my head increased until it was almost painful. In that moment, I realized that the adult ward meant there were no more safety nets. I was alone with a shattered mind. Suddenly, the room was flooded with light as a nurse burst in. Instead of showing concern for my state of shock, she sounded merely irritated that her night had been interrupted. She pulled Lucia away, who offered no resistance, and led her out of the room with a tired sigh. The nurse told me not to worry and to just go back to sleep, as if being accosted by a chanting stranger in the middle of the night was a perfectly normal occurrence. I didn't see Lucia again. I assumed she was transferred to a more intensive unit for patients who couldn't be managed in general population. I was lucky enough to be discharged the following evening, and that night became the ultimate wake-up call for my own recovery. I still wake up some nights gasping for air, feeling the ghost of a hand on my forehead. It serves as a haunting reminder of how fragile the human mind truly is. When I got accepted into a university several hours away from my hometown, I thought it was the start of a perfect new chapter. The college didn't have official dorms, so I used a roommate matching service to find a spot in a nearby apartment complex. I filled out the forms about my hobbies and habits, hoping for a like-minded student. Despite the one-star reviews online claiming the place was falling apart, I figured it was only for a year and signed the lease anyway. I moved in a few weeks before the semester started and immediately realized I had made a massive mistake. The entire unit reeked of stale cigarettes and mold, and there was a filthy, used ashtray sitting on the coffee table as a welcoming gift. My assigned roommate didn't even show up for the first week, leaving me alone in that depressing, grimy space. When the door finally opened and Vance walked in, things went from bad to worse in a matter of seconds. Vance was 35 years old, way older than the student I expected, and he wasn't even enrolled in the university. He was scruffy, smelled of intense body odor, and had apparently used student loans just to cover the application fee after being homeless. He never seemed to change his clothes, wearing the same stained tank top and beat-up camo pants every single day. It wasn't long before he started bringing his friends from the local shelters over to our apartment. I would come home from class to find total strangers doing their laundry on our machines, even when Vance wasn't there. But the creepiest part was the way he watched me. Whenever I had a friend over to hang out in my room, I could see Vance's face through a tiny crack in his bedroom door. He would just stand there in the dark, staring at us with a blank, unsettling expression as we walked down the hallway. One night, around 3 in the morning, a sharp knock on my bedroom door jolted me awake. I was in bed with a guy I was dating at the time, and we both froze in fear. I got up thinking it was Vance and opened the door only to find a completely naked elderly man standing in the hallway. He looked dirty and confused, claiming he was Vance's friend and thought Vance was in my room with me. I lost it. I threw the guy out and stormed into Vance's room. He was sitting in a chair in the corner of his pitch-black room, doing absolutely nothing, as if he had been waiting for me to catch him. He tried to play dumb, pretending he didn't know how the naked man had gotten inside, but I knew he had let him in. Eviction notices were already piling up on his door, and I realized I was living in a ticking time bomb. Eventually, the management finally kicked Vance out, and for a few days I thought I could finally breathe. But the nightmare didn't end with the eviction. One afternoon, I heard a knock at the front door and found the same friend, thankfully clothed this time, holding a massive bag of laundry. He walked forward like he owned the place, claiming Vance said he could still use my washer. I slammed the door in his face and locked it. About 20 minutes later, I heard a scratching noise coming from my third-floor balcony. I thought it was a squirrel until I looked out and saw the same man desperately trying to climb over the railing. I shouted that I was calling the cops, and he scrambled down and vanished into the trees. I went straight to the property manager and demanded to break my lease, refusing to spend another second in that building. After a heated argument where I threatened legal action over their matching service, they finally let me leave. I found a small one-bedroom apartment where I didn't have to share a wall with anyone, and I never looked back. To this day, the sound of a knock at 3 a.m. makes my heart race, reminding me of the months I spent living with a man who invited the darkness right into our home.